Well, it's good to be here again, and I'd like to echo what Dave has said about the European Group, which was set up in 1973 to provide a house and a home for radical criminologists and sociologists who could meet together from across the EU. The first conference I went to was in 1979, and I've been to about a dozen since then. And coming as I do from an NGO rather than academia, it was always good and refreshing to meet with critical academics outside of the academic mainstream. What also has distinguished, I think, the European Group over the years is that most of the people involved are active outside of their universities and academia, linking with local struggles and trying to bring their experiences into their work inside. And when the European Group comes together, it doesn't just mean you meet across the European Union, it means you can learn what's happening in different countries, understand a European perspective and put that into an international perspective. State Watch isn't the same. It was founded in 1991, which is to monitor the state and civil liberties. What we do is we provide a daily news service on civil liberties. We have a vast database of articles, analysis and particularly documents since 1976. So I just say to you that if at the start, if there's anything you want to get published to get a wider audience, we know from history we put many so-called academic activist texts on our website, and they're normally downloaded between 5,000 and 25,000 times. It's a very good way of further distributing your work. Now, on the main subjects, what I'm going to talk about are three main issues. One is the economic crisis, democracy, and the future of the EU. Then take a more analytical look at the EU state and its implications, and to finally assess the state of civil liberties and politics in the EU. So I'm starting out with the economic crisis, and you will be familiar with this, but it's worth recapping what has happened since 2008 over these last 4 years. It came as no surprise to many of us that the financial bubble and the banks were going to crash one day. And when it happened, it went global, and it was centred on the United States and on the EU. And what was the reaction of neoliberal laissez-faire capitalism? It was not to criminalise the financial crooks, but to bail them out, not let them go to the wall or nationalise them. But predictably, what started as a financial crisis quickly became an economic one, especially in the European Union and the Eurozone, which had been created, the Euro, without any concept that it would ever need a bailout fund. It didn't conceive that would ever occur. So when it happened, they had to start from scratch again. And of course, as day follows night, the financial crisis, which became economic, also became political too. The economic crisis across the European Union required reforming, restructuring, those lovely words, which in plain text mean cuts in state services and in welfare and mass redundancy, plus privatisation of state services like railways and water, etc. Now, you don't need to be an economist to know that if in the middle of that kind of worldwide crisis, if you start to cut state spending and jobs, you're going to have a problem. It's pretty obvious even to ordinary, normal, in quotes, people. And of course, what has happened? Unemployment will rise. And just last week we learned that across the EU, unemployment reached a new record of 11.3%, which disguised, of course, some appalling figures in some countries, like Greece and Italy and Spain and more. Less taxes collected, because less is generated. And what's the problem? Your problem, your financial economic, it takes longer and longer to solve. Now, if we can see it, why can't they see it? But what they've chosen to do is to use this crisis to complete the move from the welfare state to the market state, leaving the poor and the powerless to pay for the consequences of their own crisis. It's also had political consequences. We all know this, but Greece and Italy had technocratic governments imposed on them by the EU, the ECB and the IMF. Not just imposed on them, but actual cuts they were to make were imposed on them, with those three institutions placing people inside the ministries, telling them how to cut. So if one country said, we don't want to cut that way, we want to tax the rich and cut back the military, that was not on the agenda, because that wasn't the project. There was no option for national governments. Well, of course, that led also, when you think about it, to a democratic problem. Because when in Ireland and Spain, take two examples, the crisis led to a general election, unpopular governments, because of the cuts, were kicked out, The opposition won, but there was no change in economic policy. The exercise of democratic elections was irrelevant. Democracy, as in Greece and Italy, was simply suspended or discarded. The point of recapping this, what many of us already know, is that this economic crisis is also going to lead possibly to something else, another threat. And this is at the political level. There is a widespread belief in the Brussels bubble amongst the power elite that every crisis is an opportunity, I use the quotes that were said to me, to launch major constitutional change. You don't have a reason change. In time, everyone can understand where you're going or why you're going there. You use a crisis to bring about political change. This time round, it was first suggested last autumn by Merkel, then backed up by the Commission President Barroso, and then the President of the Council, and every other week they're all going on about it, because what they want to see is, quote, an economic and political union. In Brussels speak, it's a shorthand for saying they want a federal Europe today, or they want European integration to reach its end, the project as they often call it. And they've even got a name for this project. We will then become the United States of Europe. They've got the name. Now, I don't know what name a federal Europe will ever have, even if you want a federal Europe, but I'm not sure that's the best one to have. Now, in terms of a federal Europe, we have a problem. Because, suffice it to say, and we can have a big discussion, Europe is nowhere ready to become a federal Europe, even if this was desirable. There are European political parties, there's a power elite, we have European elections in which 42% of the people vote, and it's falling at every European Parliament election since it was started in 1976. But the critical thing is, there is not a democratic political culture, which is about much more than parties and elections and parliaments. A political culture, in short, is about informed people who can, in an informed way, consent, or in an informed way they can dissent. And it means you have a healthy critical media. None of that exists in the European Union. To give you one example, as far as civil society is concerned, under Article 11, the institutions are meant to engage with civil society on every aspect of union life. But how can they engage if the very documents under discussion, when the Council and the Parliament meet as co-legislators, in trialogues, in secret trialogues, none of the documents are published? Because to reveal them would undermine the decision-making process. This is right at the core. And when you get down to it, what happens then is that in the field of civil liberties, the Libe Committee, 84% of the new measures going through have been decided in secret trialogues. This simply means that when they've, in secret session, with none of the documents available, although we do try and release quite a few, although we're not meant to, they're not meant to be there, when it leaves that meeting, it goes back into the committee in the Parliament, who cannot change a dot or comma. It goes to the plenary of the Parliament, and it cannot change a dot or comma. Now, is that democracy? Is that the basis of a federal Europe? Now I want to turn to a second section, which is to look at, it's a slightly more academic section, to look at the EU state and multi-level governance, which is incomprehensible to anybody outside of academia, as are the following concepts too, which is described as the EU is described as, quote, a polity with multiple vertical layers, end quote, based on variable geometry. Now you try telling that to anybody outside of academia and they say, what the hell are you talking about? But how do we understand the present? So my first question is, when does a state become a state? Now classically, everybody's starting to write about this and dismiss it from mainstream academia. We've used the classic Weberian argument, quote, the EU does not have a monopoly of the use of the legitimate use of coercion, and the power of coercion is through national police forces, security services, immigration services, etc. It's at national level, not the EU level. But is it? Do they really know what they're talking about? We've increasingly seen, particularly since Maastricht came in 1993, the EU-wide harmonisation of laws, practices, database training, and a legal corpus of decisions. Indeed, I would argue that at this present moment, While coercive forces, police, immigration officials, internal security, may come from the nation state, they're increasingly operating under EU direction, using EU decision-making containing masses of personal data. In addition to that, the Lisbon Treaty created the Committee on Internal Security. There are lots of signals that we are moving towards a European state. Now, despite the fact that nearly all academic theories reject the idea of the European state, or it's becoming a state, they increasingly use the term supranational. Now, every time I see the word supranational, I say, why can't you say the state? Because that's what you're talking. It's above the state. It's at another level. What level is that? It is the EU. Cannot you look at it, study it, realise what's going on? But no. The point about states is, if we can learn from history, they don't just happen. One day there's a state, no state. The next day there is a state. All states in Europe have developed over generations, in some cases centuries. So it should come no surprise that I argue the EU is a state that is emerging. It is under construction and has been since 1976. And we've seen it accelerating through the Trevor era, the Maastricht, Amsterdam, and Lisbon era. It started with my concept of state building. That's why it doesn't just happen overnight. States build up powers, they bring them together, they hone them, they extend them, they develop them, and they put them into practice. In the Trevor era, which was intergovernmentalism, yes, but policy-making coordination started. The Europol Drugs Unit was set up. Asylum policy started to be defined, like safe third countries came into policy. 1990, the Schengen Agreement. Maastricht comes along. The Schengen Convention is agreed. Europol is set up in 1996, followed by the Schengen Information System. In 1999, we had the first and the only area within the EU, the Tampere Programme, covering the whole of Justice and Home Affairs for 4 years. But who wrote this? Was it the governments? No. It was an official in the Commission, official in the Council, who couldn't trust the politicians to agree on it, went to Tampere, and I was in Tampere, and they were meeting there, and the NGOs were meeting down here, and I was running down the road taking out drafts to the NGOs and going back in as a journalist. But it was chaos. They were putting things through the doors of delegates at 4 o'clock in the morning to be agreed the next morning. But it was led by the officials. Now let's take this term harmonisation, because when you harmonise 15 or 27 national laws, you tend to harmonise at the lowest possible level. Harmonisation means all national laws become one law across the EU. And there are hundreds of measures now in Justice and Home Affairs which have been harmonised.